Chris Newman with an introduction to spiritual and cultural literacy as applied to pre-colonial Maori spirituality. This is referred to as tikanga, and it's also known as tribalism. So we see that there are elements of tikanga. All this information has been detailed and documented from about 1800s right through a century and a half. It's still ongoing today, the documentation of this subject. Many of us have been told that if you're of Maori descent or Maori people are very spiritual. This may be true, but what is the meaning of this spirituality? Our spirituality could go all kinds of ways, and even though it may be intense or highly evolved or highly developed, if it's evolving or developing in a direction that's harmful to the human soul, that's very aggressive, very toxic, dangerous to children, dangerous to others, then it might not be such a wonderful thing. Let's explore the topic a little further. When we go into the elements of the tikanga, we find as they break down very simply, whakapapa is the lineage, tapu is superstition, mana is your status or pride, muru is plunder, equalising everything, denying private property rights, utu is revenge, which can be a most intense driver. And these matters are all linked up together, they're woven together under the control of the chief. Now I've explained this in many previous presentations, but let's look at the elements and how this plays out in terms of recorded behaviour. Now I am picking on particularly degraded or harsh, or they're not extreme though, in the sense of unusually extreme, because this is around the middle of the bell curve, not the ends. This is what was normal behaviour going on through the tribes, throughout tribal, pre-colonial Maori society. Spirit possession, very common. Demons, and the tohungaism. Tohungas were witch doctors or magic men, sometimes women, and the demon possession was quite a common phenomenon amongst them. Makutu is spiritual warfare, where spells or various practices were used to direct very destructive spiritual energy from one group against its enemies. There's a lot more could be said around these topics. I'm just touching on an introduction exposure to it. Cannibalism. The fact that between 1820 and 1840, some 30 to 40,000 people were killed and eaten by others is evidence that this was a very widespread. But there's more to cannibalism than just the name. Here we're just going to break down a couple of versions. One type of cannibalism called kai rarawa, and this delight is eating the body parts of your enemy and then defecating it out in an act of utter contempt and victory over that other person who you've consumed and whose descendants you can tell that you defecated their grandfather in an act of pride. You see, here's the mana and the utu and so on. Now, the next part, kai ora ora. After some of these battles, the heads of chiefs and other warriors would be dried out and brought back to the home territory. And the women, when doing weaving or other very interesting tasks which had certain tapu rights around them, would have the heads of these enemies stuck on sticks, and they would address them in absolute contempt and derision, deriding and mocking these heads. And little children would, of course, follow on what they saw their parents, aunties, and so on doing. Now, there's another cannibalistic practice called kai pirau, which is a fascinating thing to observe, and this was the consumption of decomposing bodies of enemies, an act of intense utu. Oh my goodness. So when you begin to investigate these matters, which were not extremely rare, they were quite common, you realise what we're up against. Slavery, 10 to 20% of the population were enslaved at any time. Human sacrifice, quite common. If a big building, a big meeting house was dedicated, a human might be put in the hole in the ground and the big post dropped on them to sacrifice them for this big house that was being built. Canoes, massive canoes were launched over the bodies of slaves to grease them as they slid into the water, the live bodies of these poor victims. Infanticide, right common. And genocide, we've heard about mass extermination of one tribe against another. And of the Maori arrivals, the Polynesian arrivals who came here in the 1300, and the existing population, the Patupaerehi, Te Rehu and other peoples who are here, were slaughtered out. Patupaerehi means whack the fairy. Okay, so we've got now the conclusion. We have to move to a conclusion. Moving through this, we have a pre-Old Testament state of existence and spirituality and practice, where these tribal people are living the lives of slaves, because everybody's afraid of being a slave, and those who are slaves are being controlled by slave masters who are not free, they're slaves as well. Their gods are fearsome and wrathful demon types, and these are what were carved up in the images that were always looking down on them. So this is a pre-Old Testament. Once the influence of the Christian missionaries came here, and it took many years of work to break through the cultural, spiritual barriers to reach these people who are very intelligent but extremely tied into this. We had the Old Testament idea coming of a judgmental God. Now, the prophet Te Kuti understood the eye for eye and raised up his tribe. They used to proceed around in their meeting house reciting the Old Testament Bible. And a sort of an intermediary step was a prophet called Ruakenana, who was very into mysticism, and a syncretic tribalist Bible kind of narrative developed, and he invented this Mount Zion, and he had 12 wives, and it was all very sort of a pre-Old Testament moving into an early Old Testament stage. Then in 1920 rose the prophet T.W. Ratana, and of course the New Testament is treat others as yourself, the golden rule. And he said, abandon the old tribal demon gods, give up those old ways, abandon the wood carving of idols. He said God is a just, wise, all-knowing parent, and he encouraged his followers to come up the stage from being slaves of slaves through the Old Testament idea of just being slaves and servants up to the New Testament stage, which is a higher level of development. Now, this began to take root, but what we are seeing today in this modern so-called neo-tikanga spirituality revival is a plunging and plummeting of people back through this tikanga idea back into this loathsome situation. I think some folks are only 1 or 2 steps away from bringing cannibalism back. Definitely they want to produce these spirit possession activities and the other ideas of spiritual warfare against the colonialist, all this harsh revival of all these old elements under the tikanga, which are all repugnant to our treaty, because the treaty comes in at this high level of the New Testament of treating others as you would like to be treated, of the idea of all being subjects of the Queen. So I'm going to put treaty here because treaty, so that we can understand that that is the stage of spirituality and development which is to be achieved as we become the people of New Zealand. But this treaty was offered to people from Christian foundation, to people who were living at the level of slaves of slaves. What a great blessing to be able to move from this kind of world to a world where you'd be treated as you would like to be treated and not have to live in loathing and fear and worry. So this is a simple overview. There's a lot more to the topic, but I'm only introducing the beginnings of it here. We could go a lot further, but that would take an awful lot more time as I would explore and show you how all this works and how it manifests and how it's still manifesting and messing up people's lives today. And you can probably see this sort of thing in the terrible statistics of people who are possessed by strange forces and take out their nastiness on little children. And it ends up in the courts and everyone goes, oh, Maori, poor Maori. Sorry, we have to start looking at taking responsibility for our actions and moving through the true direction of spiritual progress. Instead of heading into the pit, we should be moving up through the stages and honouring the treaty and honouring the blessing that God brought to this nation through the colonial experience, through the British common law, and through the love and blessing of all those missionaries who sacrificed to open up this foundation here and bring all those wonderful original minds and hearts of the original Maori chiefs and tribes who embraced this and saw that it was much better and were fascinated and explored the meaning. And you can see Te Kuti, Prophet Ratana, many other wonderful Maori leaders hoped and worked hard to bring their people forward, and now we're seeing the slide back through what I call critical theory, conflict theory, cultural Marxism, and all other degenerative approaches which attempt to bring this tikanga thing back into reality on the shores of New Zealand and the land of New Zealand among the people here. And I consider that that is entirely the wrong direction. And I think you would probably agree with me once you understand how all this works and how it damages the soul